Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named The Twilight Zone, 1985, Season 1, Part 4. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The 30-second story begins with an old man whispering a few words into his wardmate's waxy ear, and to everyone's shock, he suddenly burst into eerie laughter, then let out a painful scream. Within moments, he had completely lost his mind. The once quiet and ordinary town was no longer peaceful, and it wasn't long before the situation drew the attention of a senator. A government agent, Edward, was assigned to investigate. After exchanging the agreed code words with Amanda, he began sharing what was known so far. The first case was a farmer. Then a few bank employees were affected. Even the town's mayor had caught it. Regardless of race, class, or age, people were suddenly going mad, slipping into bizarre fits of delusion and hysteria. Amanda's father had also fallen victim to it, which immediately raised red flags for Edward. He started by visiting the hospital to see Amanda's father, who was locked inside a high-security room. At first glance, the man seemed fairly normal, just an elderly man with a kindly demeanor, quietly studying the young visitor in front of him. But when Edward mentioned his daughter Amanda, the man became agitated, saying he didn't have a daughter, but he had 9 sons. Trying to keep calm, Edward asked him to recall what had happened that morning. The man remembered drinking sour milk and arguing with his wife about it. The problem was that his wife had been dead for 5 years. How could he have argued with her? Yet the man just looked at him and asked strangely if he couldn't. The conversation made no sense, but Edward pressed on, hoping for more clues. Amanda's father mentioned a delivery man who tossed a newspaper into the house and vanished. Then he recalled that after the wardmate lady kissed him, he suddenly screamed in terror. Edward recoiled at the outburst, but he had at least found a lead. The wardmate had only just returned from the hospital 2 days ago. Her husband was still locked up there. Maybe she knew more. Edward asked Amanda if she had any brothers. She shook her head. She was an only child. Whatever her father had said was nonsense. The two went to visit the wardmate lady. The elderly woman welcomed them warmly and offered them food. She said she'd only seen her husband briefly the day before, and they hadn't discussed anything unusual. Edward asked what she and Amanda's father had talked about. She said she'd only asked for some gardening advice. Amanda's father hadn't seemed odd, but he did start telling her a strange story on his own. In the story, a woman's husband had fallen into a coma. Desperate, she said she would give up a year of her life if it meant he could wake up. The next morning, he did wake up, only to find his wife dead. The message of the story: never make deals and never ask questions. Suddenly, the lady lunged at them with a knife. Edward reacted quickly, managing to subdue her. She had clearly gone mad, too. Just then, Amanda came in carrying food. She gently touched Edward, startling him awake. She had gone out to buy sandwiches and even warmed them up in the microwave. Edward had been up all night and hadn't noticed anything unusual. They had already ruled out air and water contamination. The toxin levels were well below the danger threshold, so it likely wasn't something spread through breathing or drinking. It seemed more like a highly contagious psychological condition, like some kind of cursed chain letter. The first infected farmer had spoken to the town secretary. The secretary later met with the mayor, who then interacted with the bank staff. Amanda's father had spoken with the wardmate lady before he lost his mind, and the lady had just visited her husband, who had already gone mad, which suggested it was a highly contagious madness. Hoping to confirm things at the hospital, Edward and Amanda spoke with one of the nurses, who told them the patients were physically healthy. The reports showed no signs of exposure to infectious diseases, and yet the town's most respected psychiatrist had lost his mind earlier that same day. If it wasn't a virus, then what was it? Back at home, Edward and Amanda regrouped to figure out their next move. Edward requested backup from higher authorities since the situation had grown dire. The entire town needed to be placed under military quarantine. Amanda had been connecting the dots using all the information they had gathered. Strangely, every infected person could be traced back to a single common point. It seemed like the source of the outbreak might be one man who had been confined to the hospital for several months. Suddenly, Amanda remembered he had a brother named Potts, who also happened to be her university professor. He specialized in East Asian studies and similar fields. Upon learning that Potts hadn't been institutionalized like his brother, Edward set off immediately to investigate. Amanda stayed behind to man the phone. Potts might be just as dangerous as the wardmate lady had been, but there was no time to waste. Before leaving, Edward kissed her without a hormone yoga session, then jumped into his car and sped off without looking back. He soon arrived at a secluded house tucked away in the woods. Pushing the door open, he was greeted by the sight of books piled high, the sound of radio static and music humming from different corners of the room. The living room was filled with bizarre sculptures. There, among the clutter, was Potts, hard at work. He didn't seem surprised to see Edward. Potts explained that ever since returning from the East a few months ago, he'd been immersed in his research. At first, he'd planned to write a book, though now he couldn't even remember what it was supposed to be about. Eventually, he realized the content no longer mattered. Edward asked him what exactly he'd discovered. Potts stared at him intently and said he just had to listen. As he leaned in to whisper something, Edward instinctively dodged away. It had been a secret, but Potts had failed to keep it to himself. Now, he had made up his mind. Everyone needed to know, and today he was going to broadcast it over the radio. Edward lunged forward to stop him, but Potts struck him on the back of the head. He collapsed onto the floor. The clock on the table read 1:21 p.m. Edward lost consciousness, only to wake again at 1:39. A radio broadcast was already playing in the background. Nearly everyone in town tuned in to this station at that hour. Panic surged through Edward as he jumped into his car and sped home. The red vehicle tore down the road while the radio announcer cheerfully welcomed Professor Potts to the show. Edward focused on the voice in his ears. It was just setting the stage. Then came the fateful words, "What is the true meaning of life?" At that moment, Edward pulled up in front of Amanda's house. He burst through the door, shouting for her to turn off the radio. Just as Potts began to speak, Edward grabbed the radio and smashed it to onion pieces. Out of breath, he threw his arms around Amanda, urging her to leave immediately. There was no time to explain. Right then, two guests slowly emerged from the other room. Their eyes shimmered with an eerie light. Before Edward could react, Amanda leaned in and whispered softly into his waxy ear. And just like that, after learning the secret, his eyes widened in shock. Edward, too, had gone mad. Human beings are always searching for answers, but some knowledge isn't meant to be understood, at least not yet. For those who stumble upon it by accident, they find themselves lost in a shadowy realm where reason no longer applies, a twilight world between life and death. The 33rd story begins with a little boy, Georgie, being left alone at home by his mother, who needed to take care of his elderly grandmother. The hallway felt as dark as hell, and an eerie wind howled outside. Georgie kept glancing toward the end of the hallway. He'd been terrified of being alone with his grandmother since he was little. Even now, at 11 and a half, he still couldn't shake that deep fear. His mother had told him to make some hot tea, and after placing the kettle on the stove, Georgie finally had some time to do his homework. But before he could focus, a chilling scream pierced the air. Startled, Georgie pressed himself against the wall. The sound came from his grandmother's room. She was calling for the tea. He carefully crept toward the door, and his grandmother's raspy voice urged him to hurry. At that moment, something strange happened. The shadow on the floor began to move. When Georgie looked down, the entire shadow seemed to be pulled into the room. Trembling, he quickly hid behind a cupboard. His grandmother's voice continued, demanding the tea. He rushed to the stove, lit the fire, and started boiling the water, hoping his grandmother wouldn't suddenly appear. As he finally approached her room with the hot tea, the short walk felt like crossing through a swamp. For Georgie, it was like walking into hell. He slowly pushed open the dark door, and the dim light inside flickered. His grandmother lay in the spacious bed. Gathering his courage, he greeted her, but he could still see the blanket shifting on its own. The eerie, guttural sounds continued to echo. Georgie counted to 10 in his head, planning to leave after placing the tea down. Just as he was about to put the tea on the table, his grandmother suddenly reached out her hand. Terrified, Georgie dropped the tea, spilling it on the floor. The steam rose up in a wave. Panicking, he ran out of the room, his heart racing. He could barely hold himself together, wishing the time would speed up so his mother could come home and put an end to it all. Though Georgie didn't want to go back into that room, he knew his grandmother needed her tea. Reluctantly, he returned to the familiar door. This time the room was silent, too silent. The stillness was more terrifying than anything. Georgie quickly dropped to the floor and crawled forward. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room. He hurried to clean up the spilled tea, but his grandmother still hadn't moved. That's when he noticed something. One of the floorboards could be pried open. It seemed like something was hidden underneath. Driven by curiosity, Georgie tried to force it open. He was so close when he remembered the small folding knife in his pocket. He used the tip to pry at the seam, and with a sharp pull, the board came loose. Red smoke started pouring out. After making sure it wasn't dangerous, he cautiously approached the edge. The sound of countless screams filled the air. Though the smoke looked hot, it felt cold to the touch. Unable to resist, Georgie reached down into it and pulled out several ancient-looking books. He quickly slipped out of the room before his grandmother noticed, but as he left, his grandmother's hand shot out and the floorboard seemed to return to normal. Now, in his room, Georgie began reading one of the books. Although he could understand each word, the sentences made no sense. It felt like some ancient, forgotten language. The other book was his grandmother's journal. One side detailed how she was able to continue having children after dying during childbirth. The other side recorded her expulsion from the church. It was clear his grandmother was a witch. As Georgie silently read the text aloud, his grandmother's voice echoed again. This time, it sounded like she was reciting some kind of incantation. Georgie shouted for her from the doorway, but the room fell eerily silent, save for a terrifying hand still reaching out. His grandmother was likely dead, just like the chant had foretold. The graves in the cemetery had all been blown apart. He approached the bed, intending to ask her about it, but when he saw her stiff, lifeless hand, he forced himself to suppress the growing fear in his chest. He reached out and carefully checked for a pulse. Her skin felt like wax paper, and there was no pulse in her veins. Georgie quickly shoved his arm under the blanket, then stumbled back in fear. He tried to convince himself that Grandma was just sick, but how could a living person have no pulse? Suddenly, he remembered an old trick. Use a mirror to check for breath. Maybe that would give him the answer he needed. He gave himself a pep talk in his head, then picked up a nearby mirror, stretching his arm out as far as he could, not daring to get any closer. The smooth surface reflected a lump of a face, twisted and unrecognizable. Georgie could barely bring himself to look. Grandma didn't move at all. A bolt of lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the room, and in that instant, he got a clear look at her distorted features. Horrified, he bolted into the living room and grabbed the phone, but all he could hear was a woman's voice on the radio. The hospital line wouldn't connect at all. Georgie was now sure that his grandma was dead like a piece of shit, but no matter what he did, he couldn't get through to anyone. The two books on the table only added to his fear, causing him to wonder why he had to be left alone today. At this point, he knew he had to cover her face. Leaving it like that felt disrespectful. He'd already come this far. He might as well help send her off to hell properly. Steeling his nerves, Georgie tiptoed back to the bed. He reached out slowly, but just as his fingers neared her, a large hand shot out and grabbed him. Georgie screamed. A powerful force flung him across the room into the corner. His grandmother's terrifying eyes snapped open. Panicked, Georgie scrambled to escape, but the door slammed shut on its own. Grandma sat up in bed, arms outstretched. He was suddenly yanked toward her, a giant hand lifting him off the ground. She just wanted to hug her dear grandson. Now that he was finally in her arms, Georgie got another close-up look at her monstrous face. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. Her embrace tightened. A strange force began to pull him in. Moments later, the only thing left on the bed was her enormous body. At that moment, the mother returned home. She found Georgie sitting silently, his head down. She asked what was wrong. Georgie looked up, his expression heavy, telling her that Grandma had passed away. The mother immediately pulled him into her arms, whispering that, "It's okay. Kids are always shaken up when an elder passes. But Grandma's in a better place now. It's no one's fault. She'll always be with them, just in a different way." Georgie opened his eyes, but they weren't his original eyes anymore. Grandma was with them, just as the mother said. She had brought Georgie into the shadowy world between life and death. The 34th story begins with a Russian KGB investigator named Ulyanov. After years of being overlooked and passed over, his chances of wielding any real power had all but disappeared. Now, he had been assigned to a case in Siberia, a remote investigation far from the heart of Moscow. Two officials had died under mysterious circumstances in Vorkuta, beyond the Arctic Circle. Ulyanov suspected that the case was originally supposed to go to another comrade, but that man had friends in high places, so the job had been dumped on him. Between the lines, it was clear that power still meant everything. With no choice, Ulyanov reluctantly accepted the assignment. The train rolled across the endless Siberian wilderness. By the time he arrived, night had already fallen. The secretary was waiting at the station to meet him. Oddly, although it was still midday, the village looked as dark as midnight. Between October and April, the sun never rose here. The villagers survived the long nights with the help of alcohol. As Ulyanov stepped into the local tavern, he spat on the floor in frustration. A man stared at him without blinking. Ulyanov spoke coldly that gypsy music was banned in Moscow, and so he was ordering him to stop playing this superstitious, decadent nonsense. Once the tension eased, the secretary introduced the man as the mayor. Ulyanov explained the purpose of his visit, but the mayor dismissed the need for an investigation, saying one official had been torn apart by wolves, the other had committed suicide. Ulyanov sternly reminded him of the seriousness of the matter. Moscow needed full cooperation from the village. The mayor nodded and agreed to assist, though he doubted they could be of much help. He admitted that Moscow had burdened their poor village with many demands, and just like Ulyanov, they were only following orders. Ulyanov responded that he understood and hoped the village could forgive his presence. The mayor said no more. To speed up the investigation, Ulyanov asked the secretary to prepare all the necessary documents. While waiting, a child darted past him. A woman soon caught up, scolding her daughter. Ulyanov's eyes widened in disbelief. He rushed over and asked the woman's name. She said her name was Valentina. They had never met before, but Ulyanov felt a strange familiarity. Valentina slowly backed into the shadows and asked if he said that to every woman in exile. Without another word, she turned and left with her daughter. Back at the office, the secretary had finished gathering the main documents. The causes of death matched what the mayor had described. The rest were mostly boring reports. Ulyanov suddenly asked for Valentina's file. The secretary hesitated. It wouldn't be easy to find, and he hadn't been in his position long, but after some persistence, he finally dug out the record. Ulyanov read it aloud. Valentina had been exiled by Stalin 50 years ago. He froze, wondering how she could still look exactly the same as she did back then. He asked the secretary if he knew the woman. The secretary quickly clarified that was her daughter, but Ulyanov's unease only grew. He still had to focus on the case, but he had a feeling there was more going on beneath the surface. When they arrived at the facility where the bodies were stored, Ulyanov poured hot water over one of them to clear the frost and reveal the face. The corpse had been found behind the church, then transported here by the book. He asked where the other body had gone. The secretary replied that it had already been sent south to a town for processing. Ulyanov's suspicions deepened. As he poured more hot water over the first body, his eyes narrowed at the wound on the man's neck. There was no blood. The throat had likely been slit after death. The entire body was clean, no trace of bleeding. Something didn't add up. The group arrived at the ancient church, its doors sealed shut for years, preventing any entry. However, Ulyanov had a different perspective. Footprints on the ground indicated someone had recently entered or left. If the church was sealed, how could there have been recent visitors? The others fell silent, processing the implication. They continued on to the spot where the bodies had first been discovered. The red snow on the ground had vanished, and there were no signs of a struggle. At the time, no weapons had been found. How could someone have slit their throat without a knife, especially after losing so much blood? The group remained silent, still unnerved. Ulyanov pressed on, wanting to inspect another location. From a distance, the howl of wolves echoed through the air. The secretary urged them to head back, but Ulyanov, hearing a voice, immediately darted toward the sound. He ran in the direction of the noise, and within moments, he froze. Valentina was there, drinking the blood of a wolf. She was a vampire. Ulyanov's instincts told him to flee, but before he could move, he was knocked to the ground. When he woke, he found himself in a room, fortunately not naked. The mayor stood over him, saying he had collided with a branch, a common enough occurrence in the pitch-black woods. Ulyanov didn't buy his explanation. He wondered why he had survived. He had seen Valentina feed on a wolf. He couldn't let the mayor hide the truth anymore. The mayor was determined to keep Ulyanov alive, knowing Moscow would send a militia squad if he died, just as they had with the other officials. The mayor's aim was to help him return to Moscow safely. Ulyanov, however, wanted the truth about immortals, about the legends of the old Romanians. The mayor laughed it off, dismissing it as nonsense. But Ulyanov no longer trusted him. He grabbed an iron rod from beside the fireplace, wondering what the church was hiding. At that moment, the mayor smashed the boards blocking the church's entrance. Inside, the church was filled with countless coffins. Ulyanov wasted no time, flipping open the lids. Each one was empty. Suddenly, Valentina's voice came from behind. The villagers had surrounded her. She flashed her sharp, unbrushed fangs, clearly excited. The secretary stepped forward too. He had joined their ranks not long ago. Survival in Siberia required immense strength, and the secretary had embraced this power to endure the hardships imposed by the state. Ulyanov backed toward the mayor. The villagers had come here during the war, once fearing and resisting, only to realize they were all exiled by the state. The mayor opened a cupboard, revealing bottles filled with diabetic blood. Vampires didn't necessarily need human blood to survive, but the idea of humans and vampires coexisting was too much for Ulyanov to accept. Valentina, baring her fangs, advanced toward him. There was no one left to protect him now. She was about to bite into his chick neck when the secretary intervened, stopping her. The mayor believed Ulyanov had the power to change things. If he joined them, they could work together. But Valentina remained unconvinced, cursing all KGB agents to death. Ulyanov took advantage of the chaos, running for the door. He hadn't gotten far when the mayor, exhausted, collapsed. Ulyanov tried to drag him along, but the sound of wolves drew closer. The mayor shoved him aside just as a white wolf lunged at him. Ulyanov rushed to help, but another wolf appeared behind him, wanting to have a wolf baby with him. The mayor was bitten on the neck. Just as things seemed bleak, gunshots rang out in the distance. The wolves fled for their shitty lives. Ulyanov rushed to stop the bleeding. In Siberia, death was inevitable, frozen to death or torn apart by wolves. The poor village, abandoned by the state, barely had a chance to survive. The mayor showed no sadness on his face. Instead, he felt a warmth he had never known before. Finally, his head lolled to one side and he died in the snow. Ulyanov stopped resisting. None of this should have happened. Valentina hadn't expected things to turn out like this either. The vampire sanctuary no longer existed. She died, and others would take her place. In the end, only they would remain. When Ulyanov was younger, he had dreamed of making a difference, thinking he could accomplish something meaningful. But every life he saved seemed to cost 2 more. Now, he couldn't even save a single life. Valentina reminded him, what if he had weapons that could fight back against them? Ulyanov chuckled bitterly. He was too old now. The comrades here were the true Russians. If Ulyanov had the power to correct his mistakes, to save the suffering of the people, would he accept that power? Ulyanov's eyes hardened. He was back in Moscow now, the situation perfectly resolved. All the blame had been placed on the mayor. The secretary had been promoted and put in charge of maintaining order, fully qualified to serve the Soviet Union. The leaders praised him for a job well done. And Ulyanov grinned, now with the fangs of a vampire. He would lead more people into the underworld, just as the leaders had hoped. The 35th story begins with 7 soon-to-be Cambridge graduates having formed a secret society called the Devil's Alphabet, each member's name corresponding to the letters A through G. After donning their respective rings, one of them took the lead and read aloud the charter written on the scroll. They must oppose righteousness and the greed of the bourgeoisie, liberate themselves from all constraints, and indulge in wild revelry within the Devil's Den. The 7 members were Andrew, Brian, Cornelius, Deaver, Eli, Frederick, and Grant. It was their final meeting before graduation. Frederick proposed they return each year for a reunion. Everyone agreed it was a splendid idea. After all, Brian had signed a 99-year lease on the house. Grant then added a chilling condition. From that year forward, each member must return, dead or alive. Before anyone could react, he added that if a member failed to appear, it must mean they were truly dead. The others laughed and approved the addition. Frederick suggested they mark November 2nd as their annual gathering date. Everyone was expected to attend that evening, and if anyone faced an unavoidable circumstance, they were to cancel the year's meeting in advance. Grant raised the bar again. The meeting could only be canceled by a majority vote of all members, living or deceased. The others, amused by the increasingly macabre charter, enthusiastically approved. Grant pricked his finger and let the blood drip into a goblet. He instructed Deaver to pour wine into it, thus completing the charter and sealing their pact to meet every year. Fast forward 20 years to October. A Ferrari carriage was hauling away furniture. The owner of the house, Deaver, had gone bankrupt just days prior. Overwhelmed by debt and despair, he slowly opened a drawer, retrieved a pistol, and pressed it to his temple. Back at the house, the group mourned Deaver's absence. No one had expected him to die, but the meeting was to go on regardless. The bill from their final celebration clearly showed Deaver's expenses, and the rules dictated that any absent member must cover the entire cost of that year's gathering, even in death. After tallying their opinions, the total debt came to 115. Grant insisted Deaver should put the money on the table, ghost or not. Frederick snapped, calling the demand heartless. Andrew tried to defuse the argument, reminding them it was time to sign the registry. Eli reached for the scroll to hand it over, but stopped. Someone had already signed it. It was Deaver's name, and the ink was still wet. Cornelius accused Eli of forging the signature. Eli protested, but ultimately accepted the blame to avoid the fines from a breach of protocol. Cornelius solemnly raised a bottle, pouring a drink for the society's first ghostly member. Grant told him to pour an extra one, saying he must be thirsty. But Frederick suddenly froze, pointing at the glass. The wine had vanished. The room went deathly quiet. Andrew couldn't take it anymore. He shouted this wasn't funny, it's someone's sick joke. After that, he stormed out like a mad chicken. A year passed. 2 laborers showed up to collect their wages, only to discover Andrew hanging from the ceiling in his room. One of them rushed to cut him down, but there was nothing nearby he could have used to reach that height. So, how did he get up there? With 2 members now dead, Eli proposed canceling the night's meeting and even dissolving the society altogether. Grant was the first to object. It didn't matter how Andrew died. This house was shared property, bound by faith and honor. After some deliberation, the remaining 4 voted to cancel the meeting. Grant, however, insisted on holding it alone. Though the meeting was officially off, he would honor his duty. As the others turned and left, Grant poured himself a drink and prepared to sign the scroll. To his horror, the names of Deaver and Andrew appeared before his eyes, freshly written. He forced himself to remain calm and added his own name. Suddenly, a ghostly figure materialized before him. Terrified, he bolted for the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. The spirit crept closer. All that remained for Grant now was sheer, unrelenting fear. Meanwhile, Eli and Cornelius climbed into a Ferrari carriage. The driver wore the same ring as the society members. Before they could react, the carriage sped off into the night. Eli shouted at the Ferrari driver to slow down, but the man kept racing forward. Realizing something was wrong, Frederick told Brian to call for help while he gave chase. Brian rushed inside and ran upstairs, only to find Grant hanging from the ceiling, dead in the same way as Andrew. At the same time, flames engulfed the speeding carriage. There was no escape. The driver turned sharply down an alley. By the time Frederick arrived, it was too late. Eli and Cornelius had burned alive. Another year passed. Frederick met Brian on the street. There were no longer enough living members to vote and formally dissolve the society. The dead now held the majority, and according to the rules, their voices carried weight. The two surviving members could very well be sentenced to death by the very pact they once made. Still, the meeting had to proceed as agreed. Frederick told Brian he would meet him there. Brian nodded reluctantly. That night, when Frederick arrived at Brian's home, he found him dead like a piece of shit. A single letter lay on the table. In it, Brian confessed he didn't have the courage to face the unknown anymore. This was the only way he knew to escape the terror. Yet, he promised they would still meet tonight, forever brothers in the devil's alphabet. Grief overwhelmed Frederick, though his sorrow quickly hardened into rage. He stormed into the meeting room. 6 glasses of wine were already filled on the table. The signatures on the scroll had just appeared, freshly written. Frederick, the final letter in the devil's alphabet, added his name. Suddenly, the 6 others appeared, seated in their old chairs. The curse they had bound themselves to had come full circle. Frederick was now the only one still alive. He declared his willingness to continue meeting with them every year, but he proposed a new motion: dissolve the charter through unanimous agreement. 4 members immediately raised their hands in favor. Only Grant and Andrew abstained. Frederick wasn't surprised. Calmly, he reminded them of the society's original purpose. After a long pause, Andrew raised his hand in support, and with that, the devil's alphabet was no more. Frederick rose, ending their final meeting. One by one, the ghostly figures faded into nothing. Frederick removed his ring and placed it on the scroll. In an instant, a flame erupted, consuming the parchment in a sudden blaze. There would be no more signatures. The scroll had returned to the supernatural realm, never to bind another soul again. The 36th story begins with a girl, Ellie, unexpectedly landing a job at a private library. The woman who hired her gave a stern warning. The books were far from ordinary. Ellie cheerfully agreed. She'd been planning to write a novel, and this seemed like the perfect source of inspiration. But the moment she opened the doors, Ellie was stunned. Stretching out before her was an endless hallway lined with shelves, each packed with books. The employer didn't allow any outsiders in, but the woman in charge was overwhelmed and had secretly hired Ellie to help. Still reeling from the sheer scale of it all, Ellie was guided to a side room. The woman then explained that was where books were processed. Every morning, a list of requested books would appear, and Ellie's job was to gather them onto a cart, something that would greatly ease the workload. As Ellie looked around, her curiosity grew. All the books looked identical, each labeled with a name and date. She couldn't help but ask what was written inside. The woman dismissed the question casually, saying the dates were just part of the cataloging system, nothing special. But Ellie sensed something strange. This room didn't feel like part of the original house. The woman hesitated, then finally admitted the truth. These were books of life. Every book on the shelf represented a living person. The text inside updated in real time, constantly recording each moment of their life. When someone died, their book was removed from the shelf and taken to that side room. The employer needed to ensure the final chapter was properly written, and Ellie was expected to keep it all secret. She wasn't sure she fully believed it, but she began the job anyway. One day, after delivering a stack of books, Ellie wandered down the aisle and found her own. Trembling, she pulled it off the shelf and began to read. The text described exactly what she was doing: succumbing to temptation, finding her book of life, and opening it to read. Horrified, she slammed the book shut. The sound echoed throughout the room. The woman called out, asking what had happened. Ellie quickly lied, saying she'd bumped into a shelf. The books truly were alive, constantly updating themselves. That night at home, she told her sister about it, but her sister wasn't impressed. She didn't think it sounded like a real job. Their mother had just called to check in, and Ellie lied, saying everything was great and she was working double shifts. Though still obsessed with writing her novel, Ellie and her sister both dreamed of a better life and worked hard to make it happen. But as Ellie sat down to write, loud music and shouting from the neighboring apartment shattered her focus. She shouted through the wall. Their neighbor opened the door with an annoyed look. He had no intention of quieting down. His girlfriend, Kara, was moving in, and tonight was a celebration. Ellie was stunned. They clearly weren't planning to turn the volume down. If they stayed together, peace would be impossible. As the neighbor slammed the door, Ellie stared at the nameplate beside it, and an idea struck her. She returned to the library, located the neighbor's book on the shelf, and flipped to the middle. Then, pulling out some white correction fluid, she began to edit. When she got back home, her neighbor was just stepping out. He was completely transformed. A priest now, performing weddings and dedicating himself to God, no longer the lazy bum next door. With her world finally quiet, Ellie settled in to write. But just as she walked through the door, she tripped. Getting up, she noticed everything in the apartment had changed. Furniture, decorations, even the layout. The sister scolded her to keep her voice down since Kara was feeling very low. Ellie asked about the strange outfit she was wearing, and her sister casually said it was her usual work uniform. Clearly, she had no memory of how things used to be. Kara's life had changed too. She was now 37, unmarried, without children, and nearly broke. Seeing her sobbing uncontrollably, Ellie knew she had to do something. Back at the library, she took down Kara's book and began to edit once more. Now, Kara would marry a wealthy man. Their life together would be full of happiness, day and night. Suddenly, the woman in charge called out for Ellie. Startled, she threw the book onto the cart. The woman had overheard part of her muttering, the day and night part. Ellie quickly explained she'd just gotten lost in the rhythm of her work, forgetting what time it was. The woman seemed touched, saying it's easy to lose track of time in this place, and walked away. Ellie breathed a sigh of relief. Her changes had worked. Kara now walked the streets draped in luxurious furs, transformed into a wealthy, elegant woman. When Ellie returned home, everything seemed different again. Her sister was discussing bankruptcy filings with the wealthy man, but Kara still had no idea about it. The sister needed to take the papers to court. Ellie was taken aback to realize her sister was a lawyer now. The wealthy man, sitting beside her, cursed his own incompetence. To him, everything that mattered was Kara. Nothing else seemed important. All he wanted was for his wife to live a happy life. The sister noticed something was wrong with him. He might be on the brink of suicide. Ellie was startled by the news. The wealthy man blamed his choices, wishing he'd gone into real estate instead of ending up where he was now. Ellie took this opportunity to change the contents of his life story. With a few edits, the wealthy man's fate was successfully rewritten. Meanwhile, Kara and her husband were preparing for a vacation at the beach. As they arrived at a resort, Ellie noticed a crowd gathered outside her house, protesting the high rent prices. Leading the protest was none other than her sister. It turns out, the changes Ellie had made to the wealthy man's life had turned him into a ruthless landlord. In response, Ellie simply decided to swap her old home for a beachfront villa. Arriving at her new, unfamiliar house, Ellie thought she could finally settle down to write in peace. But as she was about to get started, she heard commotion from downstairs. Curiously, she looked over the railing. There, on the floor, lay her sister, breathless. In an attempt to save a boy, her sister had been swept into a dangerous current. By the time she was pulled out, it was too late. Frantic, Ellie rushed to the library, searching desperately for her sister's book, but it was nowhere to be found. The woman in charge suddenly appeared behind her. Ellie confessed it was all her fault. When the woman learned Ellie had been altering the contents of the books, her anger flared. She quickly began to search for the altered books. Ellie pulled them out alphabetically. She had only wanted a quiet place to write, never intending to change her own fate. But everything had snowballed out of control. In her hands was her sister's book, just as it was about to be sent to the room. Ellie tried to grab it, but the woman shoved her away, explaining that all life on Earth is interconnected. Change one thing and everything else follows. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the house. The employer had learned of the situation. To keep Ellie from being implicated, the woman hurriedly ushered her out, then silently opened the book's cover. The sister stood there in front of her, as if nothing had happened. Ellie rushed forward and hugged her sister. Confused, the sister had no idea what was going on. Only Ellie knew the truth. She needed to thank the woman properly. The sister still didn't understand, but when she knocked on the door of the new house, a man answered, eyeing her with suspicion. The house had a new owner, and the employer, along with the woman in charge, had probably moved elsewhere. Ellie understood this was all to avoid someone entering the magical library again and altering the course of the world. The 37th story begins with a death row prisoner, Adam, being sentenced to first-degree murder. But he wasn't surprised by the verdict. He continuously muttered the judge's words in advance until his lawyer reminded him to stand up. Adam was found guilty by the jury, and he wore a resigned expression. First-degree murder meant he would be hanged. Upon hearing the verdict, Adam suddenly laughed. The judge and prosecutor were both stunned, as if this were some kind of joke. Adam didn't want to continue this charade. He angrily lunged forward, saying this wasn't real. The judge assumed he was avoiding the truth, but Adam wasn't talking about the verdict. He was saying that the entire world was a dream, including everyone in it. The judge, annoyed, ordered for Adam to be taken away. The courtroom grew eerily quiet. Not everyone disbelieved Adam. Adam's defense attorney, Aaron, still wanted to talk to the prosecutor, Richie, but Richie just turned and walked away. Who would believe the words of a condemned man? Adam was taken back to the familiar prison cell, where 3 other inmates awaited their execution. As they reached the end of the corridor, the guards sneered at Adam. Adam didn't know which room it was. The position wasn't always the same. The guard thought it was all nonsense and shoved him into the room. Before leaving, the guard smiled, knowing he'd be the one to push the execution button. Adam was used to this by now. In the neighboring cell, another death row inmate, Jimmy, was confused and asked what was going on. Adam explained that the same thing always happened. He would be hanged by fools. A sidekick inmate didn't believe him, asking what they were now. Adam couldn't remember who the sidekick inmate was. Maybe he was a character from some bad movie. The sidekick inmate joked about being an actor. Jimmy quickly told him to shut up his smelly mouth and then explained that they were just scared to die. But Adam, in all honesty, hoped that if death could put an end to it all, he'd rather be hanged sooner rather than later. The rope didn't do the trick, though. Adam had lost count of how many times he'd been through this. He would walk out of the cell, through the door at the end of the hall, and into a dark, filthy corridor. At the end of it, there would be a dimly lit door, behind which a guard would open the door leading to the stairs. He'd climb the creaky wooden stairs, reaching the metal door at the top where more guards waited to let him inside. Once he stepped onto the trapdoor, the warden would ask if he had any final words. Not only were his hands bound behind his back, but a black hood would be placed over his head. Both he and the guards could barely stand it. Adam would tell them it was the last step, slowly placing the rope around his neck. When everything was ready, the assistant warden would press the switch, causing a red light to flash in the small room. 3 guards would wait to press 3 buttons, and once they were pressed together, the trap would trigger. After that, he wouldn't remember anything. The sidekick inmate was filled with endless fear. Jimmy cried on the spot, while Richie was still thinking about the court case. His wife tried to comfort him, asking why he didn't just wear Johnny Muffy or Algro, maybe even a pair of Bobby shorts, and start a fire in the fireplace. Richie couldn't stop thinking about Adam, and the execution was happening tonight. His wife thought Adam deserved it. Richie, however, was concerned about Adam's attitude. No other condemned man had acted like that. His wife reassured him not to overthink it and went to prepare dinner. Richie tried to relax, but before long, the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, it was defense attorney Aaron. She wanted to make one last effort to save Adam, but Richie had already made up his mind. Aaron, however, spoke differently, voicing her deep fear. What if Adam was telling the truth? Richie believed Adam was just trying to claim insanity as his defense. 2 psychiatrists had examined him and confirmed that he was fit to stand trial. Aaron had a gut feeling, waking up every day with dread. At that moment, Richie's wife came downstairs, not wanting to get involved in business, but she couldn't help but intervene as Aaron became increasingly agitated. She asked Aaron to calm down, but Aaron didn't have time to calm down. 1 minute past midnight, Adam would be hanged, and they were likely to die too. Richie's wife was convinced Adam was dangerous, a liar with a big mouth. He should have been caught long ago. Aaron sensed some personal vendetta behind this, but the 2 of them didn't even know each other. How could there be any personal grudges? She asked Richie if he had ever considered the possibility that none of this was real. Of course, everyone had questioned reality at some point, thinking everything was a dream. If he killed someone and considered it a nightmare, it only proved he was running from the truth. He wouldn't admit to the murder, so he convinced himself he was trapped in a nightmare. Aaron pressed him with a question. If this was a high-profile murder trial, then why had there been no audience in the courtroom today? Richie explained that the judge had ordered the courtroom to be cleared. Aaron insisted. No one could even remember that order. She then asked where the press was and if there were any reporters waiting outside after the trial. Richie had no answer. His silence said everything. For the first time, he began to question things himself. Back in the prison, Adam asked for the time. The sidekick inmate checked his watch. It's 9:05 a.m. The prosecutor usually arrived around this time. Just then, the sound of an iron gate opening echoed through the corridor. The inmates looked up. Richie had shown up, right on schedule. Adam wasn't surprised since the prosecutor always arrived around 9. Sometimes it was Richie, sometimes someone else pretending to be. It didn't matter anymore. Richie would call the governor, but the call would always be too late. If the call ever got through on time, maybe Adam could finally wake up from this nightmare. But Richie still didn't buy the whole dream idea. Adam pointed out that today was Sunday, and executions were scheduled for 12:01 a.m. He had already told Richie back on Monday that the sentencing would happen on a Sunday, and now here they were. This was exactly what he had said would happen. Richie had no answer. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Even Jimmy couldn't take it anymore and asked why they didn't just get Adam tested for mental illness. But Richie stood firm. This was all just a trick. Experts had already declared Adam sane. If this really was a dream, why couldn't he wake up from it? Adam had tried everything, splashing cold water on his face, burning his palms with matches, even scrambling the sequence of events. None of it made a difference. He was like a train stuck on its tracks, doomed to move forward, looping endlessly over and over again. Seeing Richie still didn't believe him, Adam calmly spoke the name of Richie's wife. Richie had never once mentioned his wife, but she was the only character in the dream who never changed. In reality, she was Adam's sister. They had hated each other as kids, and that hate only grew with age, so much that she wanted him dead. Richie still refused to accept it. Adam then quoted a line only Richie and his wife knew. "Why not throw on a Johnny Murphy or an Algro? Maybe a pair of Bobby shorts while you're at it." Richie froze in shock. He shouted for the guards to let him out. The guard rushed in, unlocked the door, and escorted Richie out, slamming Adam back into his cell. Richie was visibly shaken. That line was something only he and his wife had ever shared. Adam begged Richie to help him, but Richie turned away in silence. It was already 10:30 p.m. Erin, trying to keep her focus, asked how long Richie and his wife had been married. Richie's wife froze. She couldn't remember. Time slipped to 11:40 p.m. Richie rushed home, and Erin demanded to know what Adam had said. But even Richie didn't know what to think anymore. They were flesh and blood. They could touch, feel, remember, but could they really? Fear crept into both of them. Meanwhile, at the prison, the priest asked Adam if he had any last wishes. Adam greeted the man like an old friend. He had the same last name as his father, not a coincidence. The real man had died long ago. Adam had only one prayer: to be freed. The priest dismissed it as a form of denial, but Adam stopped trying to explain. Jimmy, now fully convinced, looked on helplessly, but Adam was still a condemned man. The guards led him toward the gallows while Richie and his wife were still deep in argument. Even his wife now felt the fear. Erin yelled. It was no longer time to think. Even if they couldn't stop it, they could at least delay it. What if it wasn't all just coincidence? They couldn't even remember how long they'd been married, or whether they were even married at all. That finally broke Richie's hesitation. He grabbed the phone and called the governor. It was nearly midnight. Adam was being strapped in. The warden asked if he had any last words. Adam simply shook his head. The black hood was pulled over his face. The executioner placed the noose around his neck. Just as the clock struck midnight, Richie finally got through to the governor and pleaded for a stay of execution. The governor called the prison, but by then everything was already in place. At 12:01 a.m., the warden nodded to his assistant, who flipped the switch on the wall. A red light lit up. 3 guards pressed their buttons at once. Adam dropped and vanished. Not just Adam. Everything began to disappear. Suddenly, it all reset. The jury walked in. Adam's lawyer was now Jimmy. The prosecutor had changed, while Erin sat on the bench as the judge. Adam was declared guilty of first-degree murder. Everything started over again. The same trial, the same verdict, a perfect repetition. If reality is just a dream, then how do we even exist? Maybe we're just playing someone else's role, or maybe we're trapped in a nightmare on an endless loop. The 38th story begins with a flaming object streaking across the sky, catching the attention of a couple nearby. The woman, Faith, gasped, thinking it was a shooting star, but Kevin shook his head, saying shooting stars didn't move that slow. Before they could react, the object crashed straight into the side of a mountain. Kevin, ever the curious astronomer, decided to check it out. The two quickly made their way to the mountainside. From a distance, they heard a strange, otherworldly sound, something Kevin was certain no known object on Earth could produce. As they moved closer, the source became clear. It turned out to be a massive alien spacecraft. Kevin pulled out his telescope to get a better look. The ship's ramp was lowering slowly, undeniable proof of extraterrestrial life. Faith grew anxious. Then aliens stepped out, armed and walking straight into the open. Their jaws dropped, and there was more than one of them. Kevin adjusted the focus and got a clear view of the beings. But before he could study them further, one of the aliens spotted them. He grabbed Faith's hand and they bolted down the mountain. The aliens gave chase. Kevin jumped into his car and started it up. Within moments, the aliens opened fire. Every blast caused violent explosions around them, but Kevin managed to narrowly dodge the energy rays. The most urgent thing now was to inform the military. Even if they might not believe him, he had to try. They sped to a small-town diner where the sheriff happened to be taking a break. Kevin and Faith rushed inside and breathlessly recounted what they had just seen, but the sheriff waved them down. Kevin described the fiery object crashing into the Centimere Mountains like a giant burning spotlight. The sheriff nodded since he'd already been briefed. According to headquarters, a military jet had gone down there. The crew had safely ejected and parachuted to the ground. The Associated Press had already put out a report about it 20 minutes ago. The reporter was already behind it. Another local chalked it up to a routine training exercise. Nothing unusual about a crash in the desert. But Kevin insisted that what he saw wasn't a jet. It was a spaceship. And those things that came out weren't soldiers, but monsters, and they shot at them. The sheriff clearly didn't buy his smelly bullshit, but seeing how worked up the couple was, he agreed to check out the crash site himself. When they arrived, military personnel had already secured the area. The remains of a shattered jet lay nearby, and a team of investigators was combing through the wreckage. The sheriff introduced Kevin to the lead investigator. When he shook hands, Kevin immediately noticed something odd. His pinky finger stuck straight out, a strange gesture. No earthling does that naturally. Kevin and Faith exchanged a glance, wondering whether the lead investigator was an alien in disguise. Kevin quickly backpedaled, pretending he'd made a mistake. He said there was no meteor, no bugs, no monsters, no death rays. It must have just been the jet. The lead investigator didn't press the issue and instead led the sheriff away to inspect the wreck. As they walked off, Kevin discreetly snapped a photo. The flash lit up something eerie, an alien figure just for a second. They thought it was a trick of the light until it happened again. The creature's skeletal form was briefly visible in the reflection. That's when it hit them. These people weren't humans. Then the officer said he wanted to show them something. Kevin quickly made up an excuse. He grabbed Faith and took off. The lead investigator didn't try to stop them, but everyone turned to watch them with an eerie calm, like a pack of wolves eyeing prey. Kevin pulled over at a roadside public phone. He tried to contact the FBI. The operator responded, saying the line was down, but offered to send a service vehicle. Kevin froze. Something felt very wrong. He dropped the receiver immediately, muttering how the aliens could have infiltrated this fast. Faith suddenly remembered. Her uncle worked as a radio operator. Maybe he could help get the message out. But just to be safe, Kevin headed to find the reporter instead, hoping he could use the Associated Press to broadcast the truth before it was too late. Kevin pulled up outside Faith's house. They agreed to meet later at the diner, and before he left, Faith warned him to be careful. At the diner, Kevin rushed in and went straight to the reporter, saying Earth had been invaded. The aliens can disguise themselves as humans. A camera flash exposes their true form. It might be something about the light frequency. The reporter looked skeptical, saying if he published a story like that, the AP would throw him out on the street. Kevin pleaded with him for his trust, saying the military might still be able to stop them. But just as he continued, Kevin noticed something chilling. The reporter's pinky finger was raised. The reporter caught his stare, but Kevin forced a smile, pretending he saw nothing. Then the local walked up behind him and put a hand on Kevin's shoulder. His pinky, too, was unnaturally raised. Panic gripped him. Kevin turned and bolted out of the diner. Faith had just arrived, saying her uncle was not human anymore. His hands were exactly like the aliens. They couldn't stay in the town any longer. Kevin started the car and sped off, but it wasn't long before a spaceship appeared overhead, chasing them down and firing larger, more destructive energy blasts. Faith shouted that they were not gonna make it. They'll blow the car to pieces. But Kevin stayed focused, saying if they wanted them dead, they would have already done it. They must have another plan. As they veered onto the interstate, the spaceship swooped in directly above them. A green beam shot down, enveloping the car in a blinding light. The vehicle lifted off the ground, sucked up into the ship by a powerful force. Inside the ship, Kevin and Faith found themselves face to face with the sheriff and two others. The sheriff sneered that even the cleverest mouse got caught, and they couldn't outrun the aliens. Kevin looked at Faith, desperately saying they had to find a way out of here. He didn't want to die without saying he loves her. That's one thing the aliens can't take from them. But Faith shook her head, saying they could take it. They already did. Her voice was empty. She said she had been reprogrammed. It was too late now. The sooner he stops resisting, the easier it gets. Then, with a sudden motion, she reached up and peeled off her face. Kevin's breath caught in his throat. He backed away, horrified, just as the other aliens began shedding their human disguises. One of them said calmly that they were impressed with Kevin's potential, and with a bit of reprogramming, he would be a perfect fit. Kevin tried to resist, saying he would never become one of them. Humanity will fight back. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they will. The reporter, now fully revealed as an alien commander, gave the order to begin the reprogramming. Faith stepped to the side to wait. An alien activated a transformation switch, and a thick gas hissed into the room. Kevin coughed, his skin beginning to itch violently. His body fought it, but it was no use. He was being changed. Back at the diner, a man burst in, breathless and panicked. He reported to the sheriff that a meteor just crashed near Madison. Kevin, somewhere deep in the alien ship, managed a twisted smile as he looked at the alien commander. The 39th story begins with the legendary Arthurian knight Lancelot, who had just been planning his vacation when 3 young men blocked his path. Without hesitation, he swiftly knocked one of them down. The others drew knives, but a teammate, Tom, rushed forward to intervene. The men tried to take him down, but Lancelot easily knocked them out with a few swift blows. Tom tried to escape, but was quickly grabbed. He explained that a woman wanted to see him, which is why they were sent. Lancelot's anger flared as he grabbed Tom and led the way. They quickly arrived at a shop. Lancelot demanded to know what the woman's intentions were, and if she attempted to have a baby with him, insisting she better have a good reason. The woman called out his name with eerie accuracy, and Lancelot's eyes widened in disbelief. No one should know his name. She asked if he still believed in magic. Lancelot's mind flashed back to distant memories, saying they needed to talk about this in private. The woman told Tom to wait outside. Once they were alone, Lancelot walked over to switch on the light, and as it flickered on, he froze. There, standing before him, was Morgan, an old acquaintance. It turns out they had both lived for over 1,000 years, and the Arthur kingdom they once belonged to had long since disappeared. Lancelot had always thought that, like the kingdom, he too would fade away, but somehow he was still here. After endless wars, he had become a man of bitterness, caught in a solitary life no one would believe. Morgan's sudden appearance made him realize how tired he truly was. Perhaps eternal life wasn't a gift, it was a curse he was forced to bear. Now, Morgan had called him here for one reason only. She began to chant over a crystal ball, and soon a mist appeared within, followed by an image. The great wizard Merlin should have rested forever in some lair, but the truth was he lay in a cave in Cornwall, the very place Lancelot had been planning to visit for his vacation. This spell was supposed to make Merlin sleep forever, but Merlin had made a trick. Lancelot's urgent need to go to Cornwall was due to this trouble Merlin had made for him. Lancelot didn't think much of it, but Morgan was more wary, saying Merlin wasn't as wise or kind as he thought. The people are like eggs in an omelet, and Merlin didn't care who got broken. Lancelot didn't want to believe it. Morgan, however, started recounting his past sins. Merlin had raped his mother and fathered King Arthur. After brainwashing the king, he had the king's wife tied to a stake to burn her. If Lancelot hadn't intervened in time, she would have already been dead. Lancelot defended Arthur, but Morgan shot back angrily, questioning who would place law above their own family. She thought Lancelot didn't follow the law either. Lancelot's expression darkened. This was a painful memory, and Morgan quickly apologized, saying she shouldn't have brought that up. Lancelot didn't press further. He had suspected that Merlin had orchestrated it all. Morgan saw something in his face, realizing that era was long gone. 1,000 years changed a lot, but Merlin was still dangerous. If that's the case, Lancelot will go there. Before Lancelot left, he suggested they bring Tom along. Morgan agreed to his request. When Tom entered to grab a flashlight, Morgan blew out a puff of smoke, and suddenly, the 3 of them were standing in Cornwall's cave. Tom was speechless. Lancelot was no stranger to sorcery, but even now, the land felt both familiar and foreign to him. This was the place where he had first met King Arthur. But those memories had faded into smoke, and he no longer dwelled on the past. He grabbed the flashlight from Tom and headed toward the cave entrance. There, standing by the door, was a suit of armor. Inside, the cave was empty. He was about to move on when the armor suddenly shifted and raised its arms in a welcoming gesture. Lancelot knew it was a preset mechanism. He quickly made his way to Merlin's side. Merlin lay weak and incoherent in bed. As red light flickered nearby, Lancelot rushed forward, took a bottle of medicine, and poured it into Merlin's mouth. Slowly, Merlin's senses began to return. Merlin had awakened this time for one reason only: to complete a mission. As he spoke, he summoned a staff from thin air. He trusted that he could rely on the strength of Lancelot, but Lancelot had long left warfare behind. So much so, in fact, that he could barely even remember the last battle he fought in. Lancelot said now they had world wars. Kings are just ceremonial figures. People prefer to choose their own leaders. Merlin scoffed in outrage, snapped that he would appoint a worthy ruler to sit on England's throne himself. How could mere peasants understand how to control the world? The 2 men couldn't have been further apart, apart in their beliefs. King Arthur had once ruled over a small kingdom, but now there were nations that held dominion over half the globe. Merlin still imagined wars were fought with swords and spears. Lancelot corrected him. Cities could now be destroyed in an instant, and so this world didn't allow for mistakes anymore. Merlin growled that he wouldn't make any, but the mistake had already been made, since Merlin chose to sleep for over 1,000 years while others paid the price. Lancelot had seen Arthur die by his own son's hand. He had no desire to relive those memories. Their time had passed. But Merlin didn't see it that way. The long sleep had only restored some of his strength. He turned and summoned a guardian with a spell, transferring a surge of power into it. The guardian glowed with a fierce blue aura. Lancelot never doubted Merlin's power, only his judgment. Just then, Tom wandered in, eyes wide with confusion. Merlin raised an eyebrow, asking who this boy was. Lancelot replied Tom was his attendant. Tom looked offended. Merlin scoffed, saying he didn't even have the basic decorum of a knight. Lancelot explained this was an age without magic. Merlin decided to go for a walk and ordered the guardian to leave the cave with him. But when they stepped outside, it wasn't the world they'd left. It was somewhere else entirely. Merlin strode to the center of the stone circle. Lancelot suddenly felt a chill and returned to the cave to grab his forgotten scarf. On the bed, he noticed the bottle of unfinished potion. When he came back outside, something felt very wrong. They were standing in Stonehenge. Merlin had planned this from the moment he cast the spell. Lancelot had always been prone to a certain obsessive pattern. Merlin had counted on that. And bringing Tom here was no accident. He needed a living sacrifice to fully restore his power. Hearing that, Tom panicked, saying he was not going to take this lying down and he would show that old freak. Lancelot quickly stepped between them, saying he won't let him do this. But Merlin wasn't about to ask permission. He sent the guardian toward them. Lancelot sneered that he was not afraid of some rusty tin can. Merlin smirked and silently removed the protection spell. That was why Lancelot had started to feel the cold. His body was reverting to its true ancient age. If not for that, Merlin's fellow sorcerers would still fear him. The guardian grabbed Tom. Lancelot shouted to let him go or he would rip that armor apart himself. But Merlin challenged him that he could barely wear armor anymore. Just then, Morgan's voice rang out from behind them. Arch rivals locked eyes. Merlin reluctantly ordered the guardian to release Tom. With a snap of his fingers, he summoned a suit of black armor. Lancelot had never liked black. It always reflected Merlin's true nature. But now, fully armored, Lancelot moved with a youthful grace, swinging his sword with strength and precision. When he turned back to face them, he looked like a man in his prime. Merlin was stunned. Morgan burst into laughter, realizing that Lancelot drank the rest of the red potion when he went back for the scarf. Furious, Merlin ordered the guardian to attack. It charged Lancelot, who met it head-on with several swift strikes. In a close clash, the guardian managed to knock him down. The tension skyrocketed, but Lancelot quickly recovered. The guardian tossed its shield aside, and the two engaged in a lightning-fast sword duel, furious and impossible to call. With a sudden spin and slash, Lancelot severed the guardian's arm. Merlin's face darkened. He tried to replenish the guardian's power. Sensing danger, Morgan pushed Tom out of harm's way and fired a bolt of red energy, interrupting Merlin's spell. Enraged, Merlin turned and launched a wave of magical force. Morgan fought back with everything she had, but the difference in their power was too great. Overwhelmed, she collapsed to the ground. Reinvigorated, the guardian attacked again. Lancelot grabbed a shield to block the blow and then thrust his sword deep into its chest. Finally, the guardian fell, its power spent. Lancelot won the duel, but Merlin, unwilling to accept defeat, resorted to trickery. He had already dealt with Morgan. Now, all that was left was to get rid of Lancelot. Without warning, he hurled a blast of magical energy toward him, but it was all deflected by Lancelot's shield. In a flash, Lancelot's sword sliced Merlin's staff clean in half, draining it of all its magic. Merlin braced for the killing blow, but Lancelot simply lowered his sword, saying his days of killing were over. Then he dropped his armor to the ground. Before Merlin could respond, his body began to wither. In the blink of an eye, he aged centuries, crumbling away into smoke and vanishing altogether. Lancelot rushed to Morgan's side, gently pulling her into his arms. But soon he was alone again. Tom stood there, overwhelmed by grief and fury, saying this was all that old man's fault. But Lancelot had already made peace with it, saying Merlin was just an old man who slept too long and got trapped in the past. Morgan had fulfilled her purpose, and the spell that granted Lancelot immortality had finally worn off. His time was coming, just like hers. He nodded his final goodbye to Morgan, then walked with Tom until they reached a fork in the road. Tom pointed one way, which was the road back to London, but Lancelot didn't move. He was staring down the other path, saying, "That's the way home, Camelot." Tom tried to stop him, but Lancelot had already stepped forward. In the distance was a kingdom of myth and magic. As a brilliant light flared around him, Lancelot disappeared. The 40th story begins with a woman named Norma who had just pushed the shopping cart back home while her husband Arthur was still busy repairing their broken-down car. If it weren't for the old second-hand car, she wouldn't have had to walk all the way back from the store. The man felt uneasy about it. They were just an ordinary American couple, living a few miles outside the city. Without a car, life would be incredibly difficult. Even so, Norma was still preparing dinner, and Arthur promised her that he would fix the car. But he had said that yesterday, and Norma was too tired to even think about eating. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Arthur opened the door but found no one there, only a package on the ground. They hadn't ordered anything, and there was no sender's address, just their names on the label. Arthur was puzzled, but when Norma opened the package, she found a box inside. Her interest instantly faded. It looked like some sort of toy. Arthur took a look and noticed a note at the bottom, saying Mr. Stewart will visit at 8 p.m. He thought nothing of it. After all, they had neighbors on both sides. But Norma felt like he wasn't taking it seriously. Arthur went outside and yelled into the street, but with people around, what was there to be afraid of? Norma, feeling helpless, lit a cigarette to calm herself. She was a woman who often felt insecure, and she couldn't stop looking out the window for the approaching stranger. She turned up the TV volume, trying to drown out the noise. But just as she turned off the TV, the doorbell rang again. Norma jumped up, startled, and peeked through the door crack. A well-dressed man introduced himself as Stewart, the one from the note. Norma admitted she had received the box, and Stewart casually walked in, complimenting their home. Norma thought he was joking. How could this modest house be anything special? After learning that Arthur had gone to work the night shift, Stewart assured her that he wouldn't take up too much of her time. He then pulled out a business card and a key from an envelope, explaining that this key opened the button on the box. He told her to just insert it into the slot on the side, and the top will pop open, making it easy to press the button. Norma, confused, asked what would happen next. Stewart locked the cover back in place, saying when she pressed the button, two things would happen. First, an unknown person will die. Norma felt a chill. This wasn't funny. Stewart was serious, insisting it wasn't a joke. It depends on her decision, and the one who dies will be a total stranger to her. And then she'll receive $200,000 in cash. Norma took the envelope, still staring at the box. Just then, Arthur came back home, noticing her odd posture. Norma told him about Stewart's visit. When Arthur heard that pressing the button would cause someone to die, he laughed, thinking it was some kind of scam. Stewart didn't offer any further details, just repeating over and over that someone unknown would die, his voice sending shivers down her spine to her smelly butt. But ever since Stewart left, Norma had been thinking, if this were real, who wouldn't choose to press it? Arthur refused to consider it, but Norma didn't agree. After all, thousands of people died every day around the world, and one more would make no difference. Arthur quickly grabbed the box, thinking there's no way pressing the button would actually cause Stewart to send someone out to kill someone. There's no way something like that would deliver the money right to their door in real life. Norma angrily shoved the box aside. After all, it was $200,000. Arthur thought it was nothing less than murder. Norma couldn't care less about who would die. Maybe it would be some homeless person or someone with cancer. Seeing his wife still hesitating, Arthur unscrewed the bottom of the box and opened it. When he did, Norma screamed in shock, but the box was empty. This proved that nothing would happen even if the button were pressed. Norma's expression darkened, and to stop her from overthinking, Arthur threw the box into the trash bag. But Norma still wasn't ready to let it go. Once she was sure her husband was asleep like a pig, Norma quietly went to the trash can to dig it out. The next morning, Arthur woke up to find that Norma had retrieved the box and was trying to fix it. Norma snapped at him to stop pestering her. Arthur felt like his wife had become a stranger, and so he didn't say anything more. Norma took out the key, still unsure whether she should open the box. By the time Arthur finally finished fixing the car, Norma was still lost in thought, staring at the box. She had even forgotten to prepare dinner. They couldn't waste the whole day on this, but the temptation was too strong. With just one press, they could have $200,000, enough to buy a new house and a new car. Despite how simple Stewart made it sound, actually doing it was much harder. Slowly, Norma inserted the key into the slot, the top popped open, and she pressed it again. She kept repeating the same action over and over. Arthur had returned from his night shift, and Norma was slowly driving herself mad. Finally, she made up her mind. Arthur advised her not to play this foolish game. It was downright creepy, but Norma was determined. She twisted open the dome, placed her finger on the button, and then, in a quick motion, pressed it. Both of them froze, drenched in cold sweat. Arthur looked around, but nothing seemed to happen. However, it had irrevocably changed their relationship. His wife had become a murderer. Arthur silently stood up and went back to bed, leaving Norma staring blankly at the box. Morning came and the doorbell rang. Norma opened the door and found Stewart standing there. He had come to take back the button device. The box looked like it hadn't been opened, but Stewart knew it had been tampered with, and only once. Norma was shocked. How could he know when there were no visible wires in the box? She quickly asked if someone had died. Stewart casually replied, "Of course." He held a case in his hands filled with 200,000. Norma rushed to open it, and sure enough, it was packed with cash. Stewart said he'd wait for her to finish counting it. Arthur, hearing the noise, came out of the bedroom. Norma, trembling, asked what would happen next. Stewart gave a strange smile and said he just hoped she liked it. The button's program would be reprogrammed and made available to others under the same terms and conditions. Norma felt a wave of panic, wondering if others would get this box too. Stewart confirmed it. With that, he turned and left. Norma was consumed by fear. The moment she pressed the button, she had chosen her fate. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.